Hello and welcome to Stretford Paddock. My name is Joe and I'm joined today by sports broadcaster Ben Jacobs for a one-on-one interview. We're going to be talking all Glazers, takeover, transfers, all sorts going on at Manchester United. But first of all, Ben, how are you doing?
Very well indeed, heading into that busy Christmas period, and Manchester United results have turned. It's a strange situation, isn't it? There was so much doom and gloom, the Manchester derby defeat, the loss in Copenhagen, and suddenly you look at the Premier League table anyway, and it's all quite healthy.
It's looking a lot better all of a sudden, isn't it? We're only, 2 points behind Tottenham, who 3 weeks ago were, in a title race, and now look at us. But it's mad that you mentioned there about we're going into the busy season. The fact that what we've had so far is considered the quiet season for Manchester United, I think tells the story of how much carnage there is at the club at the moment. Let's just get straight into that ownership stuff. You've been following this from day one, bringing updates constantly throughout the last over 12 months now. We heard 2 weeks ago that it would be next week. So last week, they wanted to get it done before Thanksgiving. These were the reports, these were the rumours. Then we heard at the start of last week, actually, it's probably going to be next week now. We're not going to get this done for Thanksgiving. Fair enough, okay. We're hearing today, and we're hearing in the last few hours, in the last 24 hours or so, it might not even be this week now. What's going on? Why is this taking so long, this 25% purchase of Manchester United from Jim Ratcliffe?
Yeah, you summed it up nicely. The hope, as I reported, was it would be done before Thanksgiving and during the international break. But the key word there is hope. And that hope came from the Ratcliffe end because Ineos are well aware that they have to get a deal done, get it announced, but then also complete. And as a consequence, it's a little bit of a race against time to influence January and formally get the keys to the club. But by the same token, it's more about the summer, because whether or not Ratcliffe comes in by January the 1st and has this sporting control, it's very difficult to influence the market overnight. And the plan is more to look at executive changes and structure rather than necessarily do what Chelsea did last January and go on some kind of mass spending spree or make significantly different football decisions on the field. So I don't think that Ratcliffe will be particularly concerned whether the completion process is January the 1st, January late, or even into February, because there's lots of other things after the announcement. But what Ineos obviously want and have been concerned about is making sure that they get this deal actually done rather than very close or almost done. And the hope was that they would be able to do that before Thanksgiving. It's taken a little bit more time. But what I would say is that we shouldn't be billing this as a delay, even though because it's so public, fans will rightly feel like they were promised one timescale and it didn't materialize. This is also very common in every single takeover. It's just that it doesn't play out as publicly. And the reason for, if you want to call it a delay or a lack of announcement, is one, it has to be 100% done and announced to the New York Stock Exchange, and it needs obviously board approval as well, whereas some other clubs with different structures can make an announcement when they're heading into a period of exclusivity or before it's 100% signed off, and they can say that there is a plan to get it done in a set time scale. And we've seen that in, for example, the case of Chelsea. They made it clear that Clearlake Bowley were the preferred bidder. Clearlake Bowley were entering into an exclusive period. The hope was that it would be done by mid or late May. Manchester United, because of their structure, can't do that. It needs to be 100% cleared and agreed and announced. So even if it's 99.9% done and everyone's comfortable making an announcement with the direction of travel, there might be a random legal point, logistical point, negotiation point that stops it from being done. And obviously the Glazers are not going to rush over anything. And as a consequence, we have to keep waiting. So the state of play at the moment is that this week, I'm now told, for the announcement is unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. So we're probably looking at next week now. And then from Ratcliffe's point of view, he still needs to go through that completion process, which in a worst case scenario could take 6 to 8 weeks. It might be a little bit quicker than that. But again, people need to understand that the announcement doesn't mean immediate change. The announcement means a new era. The announcement means a new long-term plan. The announcement obviously means a new 25% owner. But as far as then impact after that announcement, there's still all of the other box ticks as well. So I wouldn't build this as a delay per se, even though, like I say, fans will constantly say, but you told us it was this date, you told us it was that date. Well, what we actually said is the hope was to try and get it done for a set date, or the expectation was during the international break. It hasn't materialized, unfortunately, and that is just takeovers and sometimes how they work. But obviously, once it's announced, there are still other things that need to be done to formally complete. And that includes the Premier League owners and directors test, that includes the transfer of funds. And then in January, Ratcliffe will start to be able to actually influence the structure of Manchester United and ultimately the football side. And that was always the aim, to influence January onwards. So whether the announcement is today, tomorrow, next week, mid-December, as long as Ratcliffe can get in for the new year and start practically influencing the sporting structure and the football side, he'll be happy. So where the worry would come in my opinion, is more if we're getting to Christmas and there's still no announcement, because that might suggest that there's a hitch or a problem. But at the moment, sources are billing this as routine. They're saying don't view it as a delay so much as normal, late negotiation, logistical and legal hurdles that happen with every takeover. And because it has to be 100% done before they can make this announcement, that's why we've not heard anything yet.
Okay, well that's good. I was going to ask you if there's any concerns, but obviously you've just clarified there, as it stands, this is considered normal. Just moving on a little bit, and I've been thinking this for a while, and I've mentioned this, but obviously you're someone that is following this more closely. You have more experience of this sort of takeover than I do in terms of reporting and what it can actually mean. I know obviously officially Jim Ratcliffe will have to pass the owner's test. He'll have to wait this 6 to 8 weeks. That's once an announcement has been made, before he can be in there, be signed off, be on the board, be whatever, have his title changed, get the name tag on the door and all that. But we've already seen the CEO of Manchester United announce that he's leaving. We've already seen changes. There's no reason why he couldn't change things and we couldn't start to see a turnover of staff like we've already seen before these checks and balances have been officially done. Because, you know, once he's in there, surely his influence can be, you know, an elbow in Joel Glazer's ribs can be heard without the contracts being officially signed.
Yeah, I think we should look at the case, though, of Richard Arnold as atypical, right? Because sources had always indicated, regardless of either Ratcliffe or Sheikh Jassim or anybody else, that he would be leaving the football club at some point. And then my sense is it becomes the end of the year because we're getting a new era that will start at some point in 2024. Maybe if there was no resolution to the takeover, Richard Arnold could have been persuaded to stay on until the end of the season. But I think that he was always likely to be outgoing. In terms of other changes, I think the short answer is that it's not sensible for Jim Ratcliffe to be making wholesale changes before he assesses the club, because it's one thing wanting a name and having a plan. It's another thing doing recruitment and lining things up. But you're never really going to know the state of play until you're inside the club. So even if Ratcliffe is positive that he wants, for example, Jean-Claude Blanc as CEO, he still probably needs to come in and talk to people and see how the club functions. And it's a two-way process as well. There will be names that also want to be told categorically that Ratcliffe and Ineos are in. How's their first month? How's their first 100 days? What other changes are going to be made? So if you recruit too fast, it can be chaotic. I think that Chelsea fell victim to that within their first 100 days or so. It might seem like every individual name that you bring in is right, but you have to build a new structure, a new chemistry, a new hierarchy. So if you move too fast, then you don't get a transition period. And in most of the takeovers that I've covered, the transition period is highly important. And then also, if there's an incumbent, if there's somebody in position, it's relatively unfair to pre-replace them before you walk in the door. Maybe they deserve a chance. Maybe you learn something about them from within the football club that you didn't realize from the outside, and it changes your perspective. So this is why I think we're not seeing wholesale changes. Maybe fans feel like they want a Paul Mitchell, Paolo Maldini, they want a new CEO, they want a new structure, they want certain individuals at Manchester United out. So again, if you take them individually, it feels like making those changes is somehow going to create positive change. But this isn't recruitment. This isn't football. This isn't a transfer on the field. Obviously, if you pluck 3 names out the hat on the field and you bring them in, then there's a fair chance you can slot them into a hypothetical Manchester United formation and say, we're improved, we're better, we've got the depth we need, we've got the quality we need, we've got the goals that we need. But with executives and with structure, it's much harder, because that executive has to, more so than a player, I think, understand the club, not just from a football side and a culture side, but also from a brand perspective. They have to get their head around working for Manchester United and all of the past and all of the struggles and sometimes all of the battles between brand and football, and between Glazers and managers, or executives and managers. And you can't just do that from the outside in. And this is why I think that there's a list of changes based upon a structure that Ratcliffe wants to bring in the football side. But if they all happen at once and they all get lined up before he even comes in, then Manchester United could be quite unsettled. And maybe, although I don't think Chelsea managed it, but maybe you could make an argument you could get away with that during an off-season in the summer. But if you do all of that in January or before January, who's to say that it won't impact Manchester United negatively in the second half of the season?
That's a good point, yeah. I think we want things to be quick and we want them to be exciting, and here's the new team and Avengers assemble and all that. But actually, maybe it's better for things to be assessed and done, step by step, rather than this wholesale change based on who looks good on Twitter, because that's, a research a lot of Man United fans, myself included, are doing. Obviously, we're getting closer to an announcement. Every day that goes by, theoretically, we're getting closer to an announcement, assuming one is going to come eventually. Do we have any more details on the actual structure of this deal? Because I think it came out over the last few weeks about the Class A and B shares are going to be split relatively evenly. It's going to be a relatively close split between Glazer and non-Glazer shares as well. That aside, obviously, if I've made any errors there, then feel free to correct them. Do we have any more knowledge on the sort of the next steps in terms of a chance to buy, an obligation to buy, et cetera, of more shares? Because there were rumours a week or two ago now that there wouldn't be any obligation to buy included. Do we know any more on that as we get closer to an agreement?
Yeah, I think that an obligation to buy is what the fans want, but an option to buy is usually the norm. It could be two-way with the so-called put and call clause, which means that at one given point in time, the Glazers have the opportunity to sell to Ratcliffe, and at another point in time, Ratcliffe has the opportunity to sell to the Glazers. I think 25% is probably geared to get to 50%. And then potentially to all 69%. I don't think that Ratcliffe is planning to buy 100% of the football club and delist the public shares. And the reason for that is because ultimately he's paying that extra, let's just call it 1.4 billion, and he could be investing that in the football club. Ratcliffe wants control, sporting control to begin with, ultimate control in the long run. There's no point in investing all of this money into the football club, and some of it's coming from his personal funds, if he's just going to sit there as a passive minority owner. So there will be a path to control, we're told, but it's one of the most complicated legal deals and structural deals in or outside of sport. And as a result, it may have to be broken down into two parts: a straight 25% purchase, and then all of the other stuff to come at a later point, which would lend itself towards a conclusion that that side of things will be optional rather than any kind of obligation. I think that there'll be options for a staggered buyout, as with 49ers Enterprises and Leeds United, where Ratcliffe slowly increases his shares over time. And the only difference is that with 49ers Enterprises, they did make a binding commitment to eventually buy the club by the latest 2024, and they instead chose to do it last summer, even though Leeds United got relegated. So if there's anything binding like that, then fans will be, I think, a bit more comfortable, because they'll feel like Ratcliffe is definitely going to replace the Glazers. If it's optional or it's 25% to begin with, there'll be a bit more reticence. Then in terms of what they've been debating, away from those clauses, there is also a possibility, as I think I spoke about on the last show, where Ratcliffe could actually increase his stake by injecting equity into the club rather than buying more Glazers shares. And that could help him creep up above 25%. And the equity that he injects into the club would also be beneficial to Manchester United as well. So that's another structure to keep an eye on. And then as far as the 25% is concerned, my understanding is that it's 25% of the B shares and 25% of the A shares in equal measure. So we should clarify this just for those that are not across the maths, because the other option is 12.5 and 12.5. So one is a equal amount of shares, 12.5 and 12.5, and one is an equal percentage of shares. In other words, you buy 25% of the Glazers 69 and you buy 25% of the remaining 31. And that's a better deal for the Glazers compared to 12.5 and 12.5. So I'm not a mathematician off the top of my head, but basically 25% of 69 is give or take 17 or 18%. And then to get to the rest of the 25% that Ratcliffe will own, it's 25% of 31, which is basically 8. Let's just call it. I'm terrible at maths, but let's just go with those numbers, even if they're off by 0.5%. So the Glazers get 17 odd percent of their 69, as opposed to 12.5. So that's a better deal for the Glazers. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you convert 12.5% of 69 and 12.5% of 31 to get to the 25, then as a percentage, it gives more of the common shareholders the opportunity to sell. So those are the considerations. And I think that the consensus is that there will be no litigation or issue with this 25% of 69 and 25% of 31 to get to your 25%. Of course, if you ask the common shareholders whether they would prefer 12.5 and 12.5, then in that structure, more of them would be able to take the option. And if the share price is 33%, which is at a premium compared to the market value, you would presume that there'll be plenty that want to take that option and cash in. So that would be their vote in an ideal world, but it's not something I think that the Glazers would sign off. So we think that the structure is going to be 25% of 69 B shares and then 25% of 31 A shares to get Ratcliffe to his 25% at something in the region of $1.7 billion. And I use the dollars number because conversion rates change all the time. So you'll sort of see it at about 1.2, 1.25, 1.3, 1.4 billion. And that's just because the conversion rate changes all the time. But it's somewhere, I'm told, between 1.6 and 1.7 billion US dollars. And again, I say it in US dollars simply because that is the currency of the bidding process.
Great. I mean, just every time you hear anything about the Glazers and Man United, you realise just how weighted in their favour the entire financial structure of Manchester United is, isn't it? They bought it, they listed it, they kept all the control. Now they get to sell that control at a premium. They've just absolutely masterminded a real... these are my words, not yours. A real heist on Manchester United, I would say, how they take all the control and still make all the money without spending any of their own. It's almost amazing if it wasn't so damaging to the club that so many of us absolutely love. Just moving on away from the Glazers stuff onto some transfers. There's been rumours coming out of Spain yesterday about Carlo Ancelotti and a potential look at him and interest in him, seemingly from relatively reputable sources, according to Madrid fans that I saw speaking online. So again, I'm not going to stand up and say that myself. Is there any truth in this link to Ancelotti? And if there is this a potential PSG link, Jean-Claude Blanc? What's going on there? Are we reading too much into this?
Yeah, I'll come on to Ancelotti in a moment. I just wanted to make a really quick point on the previous point that you made, because fans will sort of look at the whole process with Ratcliffe and they will conclude that Ratcliffe wanted to buy 69%. He went to 50% and now he's at 25%. The Glazers have got everything their own way. As you say, they've not put their own money in the club. They've relied on debt. And now they're in a position where they can stay, and you can almost bill Ratcliffe as just constantly changing and being flexible because he wants to get in at Manchester United Football Club. So the Glazers have had their cake and eaten it. And I understand that it's a neat narrative, but the only counter I would just briefly make to that is that the share price we understand is $33, which is very interesting because the feeling from sources throughout the process is it would end up being a minimum of $35 a share, maybe even $40. Now, if you do the approximate maths, and again, market values of the football club change, but $33 a share puts the market value of the club at somewhere in the region of 6.2 billion US, which is just over double the market value. Again, that market value of the club will change, but when I last looked, it was about 3.1 billion US. So it's basically double, maybe even just over double the market value. And yet when Sheikh Jassim pulled out, they quoted a current market value at 3.2 billion US and said they bid double, which means that they're hinting through sources that they bid 6.4 billion US. Now, if that's true, it means that even though we've been told all along that Ratcliffe is always higher, Ratcliffe is significantly higher, Ratcliffe at $33 a share might be slightly lower than Sheikh Jassim. So that either tells you that the Glazers have decided they want to stay and Ratcliffe's actually been able to get a relatively decent price, or it tells you that Qatar were never up at 6.4 billion or above, and Ratcliffe's the best offer. And again, he's been able to get $33 a share because he hasn't really had any competition. So you can argue it in a number of different ways, but I think the price leans itself towards Ratcliffe actually getting a relatively decent deal, even though it's kind of double the market value. Then with Carlo Ancelotti, I've seen the reports out of Spain. I've made some calls. I think that it's going to be very difficult to get Ancelotti to Manchester United. We shouldn't rule out a renewal at Real Madrid. Everything's going according to plan. And obviously there's been long-standing reports as well that he's also been approached to be the next manager of the Brazil national team. At this stage, regardless of links between, say, Ancelotti and Jean-Claude Blanc, it's important to state that Erik ten Hag has got the faith of the ownership. They're not thinking about replacing him in the summer. They're not pre-promising a role to anybody. If Erik ten Hag was to leave Manchester United, it would be because results head in the wrong direction. If Manchester United finish in the top 4 or top 5, if 5th place ends up getting that Champions League spot, then ten Hag is staying. There's no job there for Carlo Ancelotti. And even though it is true that there are those within Ineos that are well connected to Carlo Ancelotti, and even though it's also true that every single football club has a succession plan, so even on day one of employing a manager you want to keep for 10 years, you are still constantly thinking about replacing that manager. I spoke to Paul Barber when I was in Miami, the CEO at Brighton, and he said they've got a succession plan for De Zerbi, but it doesn't mean that they're resigned to losing him or they're just going to roll over. So this is why sometimes these things come out. But anybody that knows Ancelotti knows that he's respectful and that he doesn't engage in any kind of significant negotiation when there's an incumbent and when there's not a guaranteed job. And at this point, nobody's told Ancelotti that there's a vacancy in the summer, because there is genuinely still that belief in Ten Hag, at least for now. And we wait and see how the season goes. Things can change very fast in football. So I think that any kind of conversation or approach to Carlo Ancelotti needs to be seen in that context, because whether or not he knows people, whether or not somebody sounds him out, Ancelotti will not engage and Ineos will not engage at this point, because Ineos are not through the door. And Carlo Ancelotti is not the kind of manager that starts lining up his next job before a concrete vacancy actually materializes. And that is also why he's not committed to Brazil. So I wouldn't read too much into this at this point, and I certainly wouldn't read it yet anyway as a sign that Sir Jim Ratcliffe is going to bin Ten Hag in the imminent future. Football's just a results-driven business, so we'll have to wait and see how the second half of the season pans out.
Right. So basically, there's a chance then that United are interested, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to worry about Ten Hag and that things are getting sacked off and he's going there. just it makes sense, I suppose. It does make sense for a business the size of Manchester United to have different plans for different eventualities. That does kind of make sense, doesn't it? Right, Ben, thank you very much for coming on. It's always great to chat to you. And hopefully, I say this every time, hopefully the next time we chat, it will have been announced and we can talk about maybe even a quote from Jim Ratcliffe, maybe more details, maybe everything will be wrapped up in a nice bow and we can actually rejoice at someone taking a bit of control at Manchester United other than just the Glazers.
I would just say before we go, you should basically be aware that announcements are also quite underwhelming in many ways because everyone kind of knows it's a case of when, not if. So the announcement will come and then it might be quite short. Usually they're through the club. People have asked me throughout the whole process, is it going to be Rain? Rain will never make an announcement. It's possible the group can make their own announcement in addition, but normally they're joint announcements and they're through the club. And obviously in this case, it has to be done via the club because the New York Stock Exchange. I don't necessarily know if we'll get a Ratcliffe public statement in addition to what the club put out. But then obviously because we know it's happening, I'm not sure the announcement will shed tons of light on every single aspect of the deal. So we still might have to be patient into 2024 to actually wait for Ratcliffe to speak to fill in some of the missing gaps.
Well, we've been patient so far and we'll continue to be patient. Thank you again, Ben, for coming on. Thank you for watching at home. Hit subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you in a bit.